So if you didn't know, Mike Knoop is the founder, well, one of the co-founders of Zapier. And I'm sure everyone here knows of Zapier. And if you don't, then you probably shouldn't be here because it's that cool of a company, to be honest. And it probably integrates with all of your products. So we're just going to kick it off, and I'm going to dive right into his story. So, Mike, I want to ask you, how did you get into your startup? So I learned a little bit about your story, and it started at a hackathon, but I want you to dive right into all the aha moments that came in between you starting that project and this project turning into this company.
Yeah, so this is a good question. So we actually got started at a startup weekend back in October 2011 at small college town in Missouri, Columbia, Missouri. Mizzou, go Tigers. M-I-Z. There we go. Good job. Yeah, so I have two co-founders, Brian and Wade. Brian, I had been getting beers with for like a year. We were two guys in Columbia that were both like hackers, right? We wanted to program stuff. We've been talking for over a year on like what we wanted to build and really never got any projects going. And I remember specifically that there was a moment in time where Zapier could have happened or not happened for me, which was I got an email from Mizzou, the student email they send out, and it had a bottom thing that said, hey, there's a startup weekend this weekend. It's the first ever. If you want to come work on a project, come do it. And it was $100. Now, as a broke college student, I was kind of like, oh, I don't know whether this is going to be worth it or not. So I messaged Brian on Facebook and I said, hey, are you like going to show up to this thing? It's $100. I don't know if it'll be worth it. And he's like, yeah, I think it might be worth it. Sounds kind of fun. So we went. And like, if I hadn't gone to that with Brian, Zapier, at least from my perspective, wouldn't have happened. Ended up building the prototype of Zapier at the weekend. Brian was the one who pitched the idea. Brian and Wade had been talking about back and forth for how to connect APIs. Wade was like a technical marketer. I was big on the Facebook platform, so dealing out with APIs, and it just kind of made sense that like if there was a way that you could connect a lot of this stuff and automate the things we were doing for our work and what I was doing for freelance clients, maybe there'd be something here. It built a prototype over the weekend that connected, I think it was Highrise, PayPal, and Twitter together, and ended up winning the startup weekend, which kind of gave us the momentum to keep going. Which from that point, what does keep going mean? Again, I was a full-time student. Brian and Wade were full-time employees, so it was nights and weekends. Like that was the only option. We didn't see any other option to get this thing off the ground. So over the next 3 to 4 months, basically, every day after school, for 5 o'clock for me, after they were done with their day jobs, we would either be like working online together, or we'd go work at like a local office together and just start trying to like prototype this thing and get it off the ground. Eventually we found early users that were willing to use Zapier, the prototype we had, and put up some landing pages, which we can talk about, some strategies there. Eventually got into YC, not the first time, but applied twice. We got rejected once. Moved out to Silicon Valley in 2012 and launched, and it's kind of been a growth story from there.
So I want to dive into some of your early struggles and early wins with marketing your product. And as you said, you applied to YC, you didn't get accepted the first time. And so for anybody that's ever applied to an accelerator and has gotten rejected, you may be the next Zapier, so you don't know, right? Zapier.
Hold on. Here's the mnemonic. Zapier makes you happier. That's how. All right. Now you all know.
So you may be the next Zapier, and so I want you to dive into some of your early wins and early losses, and tell me about them.
Yeah, early wins and losses. So, what's the most interesting one? Okay, so I think right away, you talked about us not getting into YC right away. We basically applied with the prototype of what we built during Startup Weekend. It was like the janky thing we built in 3 days. We had no customers actually using it. And honestly, that was a little frustrating when we got that rejection email, because we were like, we think there's something here, and it kind of put us in the mindset of we're going to prove these guys wrong. What can we do to actually get this thing off the ground? We're what do we need to do to prove that this thing is good? Just ourselves too. And the first thing we realized was we need customers. So what we did was we put up a bunch of landing pages on the site. This was before we really had a product that anyone could actually use. Zapier wasn't a thing at the point. And we just did a quick poll. We looked around online and said, okay, well, here's the top 50 apps we think people might want to connect. And we did this based on looking at comment threads. People had, if you went to Highrise blog, they had some blog post announcing a new integration with Highrise, and there were literally like thousands of comments from people begging for like other integrations than the one they built. And we realized, like, if Highrise is never going to listen to all these people because there's like everyone's asking for something different. It's just too much noise. But maybe we could like aggregate demand across all of these places. There were people on Stack Overflow asking for this stuff too. So we put up a bunch of landing pages, one for each app we thought we could integrate with, and then pair pages. So like a page that says, integrate with Highrise with Trello, and just collected email addresses on those, and use that to basically decide what apps we built first. And that really worked, because what we would do is the ones that we built, we would then email all the people and say, hey, we've got it, come pay us. Our first 10 customers were all paying us about $100. We like made them all pay to get into the beta program. And after I saw that first money start rolling, and that was kind of like that first early win when it started feeling a little bit, for me, more real. Like, hey, people are willing to pay for this. There must be something here. Even though, like, I didn't quite see it, I think, at the time. It still felt really early for me, that external validation of, like, people were willing to put down $100 on PayPal and just pay us and jump on the phone to set this thing up. Yeah, that was an early win for us. As far as losses go, yeah, I mean, the getting into the YC, I think that was like the big one early on, or not getting in for that first application. It was kind of like, yeah, if we want to prove it, which put us, I think, in the right mindset for the next like 4 or 5 months before we did.
So what was the aha moment where you guys were going to quit everything and you're like, okay, this is very real? Is it when you got your first customer? Was there this conversation that was happening, and you could just see it, the future, and you're like, oh my God, either we, do this now or it's not going to happen?
Yeah, this is a good question. Actually, for me, it probably wasn't actually until after we launched. So we launched in summer 2012. We had built the first 50 apps on Zapier ourselves. Zapier, if you aren't familiar, it's a integration platform. You can connect apps together using our software. You don't have to know how to code. We had built the first 50 ourselves just based on users asking for them. And when we launched in summer 2012 on TechCrunch, we got the classic TechCrunch blog post. We had Olark on the site at the time, and for literally, I remember nonstop for 3 days straight, we had user after user talking to us and saying, I want app X, Y, Z, Q, R, S, T, like all these apps I had never heard of. I had no idea the SaaS market was this big at the time. I thought 50 would do it. So yeah, when I started seeing all of these different apps that people were asking for, it made us realize, like, if Zapier is going to be a thing and successful, like, we have to figure out a way to scale like the number of apps we have, which is one of the things I'm like most proud of from that first summer, which was from the moment we launched on TechCrunch in 2012, which was like public sign up, through building a platform that other partners could build on Zapier to launch their own apps with, and we got 13 partners to do it, including HubSpot and Podio were like the two big headliners, and then launched that again back in TechCrunch was 5 weeks. So 5 weeks from realizing that we needed that to launching it, and like that early momentum was kind of like the big aha thing for me when we were able to like get that many partners on that quickly. And that was like, this is how Zapier is going to scale. And honestly, over the last 4 years, that's how it's gone. We've just added more apps, and that drives users for us. That's what our users care about.
So you guys are rocking and rolling. Everything's like going good. It's going to scale, and all of a sudden you realize you have to hire people, right? And you come across this moment where, do we go remote? I mean, walk us through that. I don't think anybody here knows what that thought process is, especially when you're hiring your first like key employees, right? And how that discussion even came about. Because at the time, hiring remote employees was so new, and you guys are really the leader in that market, right? So talk about that and how that came about.
I think like Buffer was around slightly before us, and of course like WordPress and GitHub was remote at the time. So there were a couple examples of companies that were doing this successfully, but not a lot. So for us, yeah, so after that summer in 2012, it was just the three of us still, Brian, Wade, and I, and we were, our first hire was someone to help us out with customer support. As an integration product, you might imagine customer support is pretty tricky for us. That summer, we would literally spend the first 4 hours of all of our days answering like our customers' problems and like helping them set Zapier up, helping them get set up. And we were doing it was like the worst setup in the world. We would have all of us had like Gmail accounts, and we had the same email that would go into all of our inboxes at the same time. And we would like all sitting around the table like, all right, who's going to answer that one? And we would just do this for 4 hours until we finally got to the afternoon hours where we would actually work on like building the product. So this was like a really big pain point for us coming out of the summer. Like we need help with this, otherwise we're never going to be able to like keep scaling this thing. And after that summer was over, this was the summer we went through YC. My girlfriend at the time, now wife, was finishing school back in Missouri. Brian and Wade's wives had moved out to California with them, but I wanted to like split time. I wanted to finish out time. I wanted to go back and spend time with her on a couple weeks and come back. So I was kind of doing like 2 weeks in Missouri, 2 weeks in California, and flying back and forth. And this is basically when we wanted to start hiring. So we kind of thought like, well, the people we want to hire, we had a couple people on our network we wanted to hire that we thought would be really good at this role. They were not. We knew they would never move to California. I'm already being remote. And we'd already been kind of doing the remote thing before YC. Like we knew, oh, we could do this because we did it for like 6 months before we moved out to California. So it wasn't really like, I'm not even sure there was like an intentional, Zapier is going to be a remote company. It was just like, let's just try like hiring this way. And it worked. And it kept working. As we hired more and more people, we found like there are a lot of really big benefits to hiring remote. The number one thing is we can hire the best person anywhere. Like this is the big trade, like there's trade-offs of remote work, of course, but the big one from a company standpoint is we can hire the best person in any market, right? So we are not limited to who we can convince to move to like the Bay Area or a 50-mile radius around it. We can accept applications from any country. I think we're up to like 13 countries now and probably 25 states, I think. And we can say yes to whoever the best candidate is. It doesn't matter where they're located in the world. And once we realized that and figured out a way to hedge against the downsides around communication, it was off to the races.
So do you think this is a strategy that more companies should be taking advantage of, especially now that it's 2017 and we have sites like Upwork? I mean, you can find whoever you want. And I mean, for God's sakes, like we have the internet, right? If you want to find someone who's the best developer, let's say it's for like Chrome extensions, whatever it may be, you can find that person.
Well, especially if you're building software, I think it's the way to go. There are certainly a category of companies that like remote work isn't going to work for. I mean, if you're building a rocket, there's no way for you to like work remotely to do that. Unless you're like designing it in AutoCAD or something and then like handing it off to an engineer in another country. But generally, like there are certain things that you're going to need to be in the same room for. To build software, I don't think is one of them. And I think we've proven that. We're 85 people now. We've got like 6 or 7 like small teams in Zapier that are made up of PMs, designers, engineers that all work remotely. We figured out a lot of processes that work to get this done. It's definitely possible. And yeah, I think that more people should be doing this, especially in the software industry.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that really behooves me is how many employees don't take advantage of just outsourcing work or actually getting people who work remote in other countries just to do some of their work. That's something that I still don't know why people aren't taking advantage of it. I mean, you could basically not do your job and still do your job.
Why are you still doing your job?
That's a great question. I'm still trying to figure that one out. So one of the things when I bring up Zapier is people always talk about marketing through engineering, and they say Zapier, it basically markets itself. Now, I want you to either dispel this notion or, you know, say that's partly true. And I know you guys also create a ton of blog content around actually like these integrations and whatnot. So dive into how you guys are marketing your product and how much of it really comes from having a strong product market fit.
Yeah, good question. So marketing all comes down to channels, right? At the end of the day, you got to find channels that work for you. The big ones that we found are the landing pages that we have, the partner referral network we have, and word of mouth. I think an interesting thing that I didn't include in that list was the blog. Our blog serves a lot of purposes for us. Signups is not one of them, at least not in a high capacity. Content marketing is really effective for us as far as helping our partners. Like Zapier is a platform. We have partners who want to be on Zapier. It helps establish us as like an authority in the space, writing about app productivity. And actually, one of the best things our blog is good for is it's basically a second product. This is my favorite way to think about our blog is Zapier is kind of one of those products like Excel, where if I told you about Excel like 10 years ago, you'd probably think like, okay, that's cool, and then go on with your day. Zapier is like that for a lot of people I talk to, where they don't have a use case right away. Finding the use case is like the light bulb. If you don't have a use case right away after you sign up, the blog is like literally the next best thing we can get you described to, because all day long we talk about use cases on the blog. So I almost see it as like a secondary product for us, where if we sign up to the homepage and can't get you to find something, let's at least get you engaging with our content. But yeah, the blog is a small part. Our big channels again are referrals, word of mouth, and our landing pages we've got.
And one of the problems that I've seen come about from companies that have strong product market fit and they get a ton of traffic and signups from referrals is that they can't really track anything. So they have really bad attribution. No matter how much time they concentrate on it, it just doesn't do enough. So can you talk a little bit about how you guys manage your attribution system and dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is a pretty interesting topic. I have an anecdote I can share about this. So early in Zapier, we tried the classic Dropbox style referral model, right? Like where it's we'll incentivize you basically to send Zapier links to your friends and family or whatever to share Zapier. This was before we really knew who our target audience was, so we kind of thought maybe Zapier would be right for people who want to write it on their personal blogs or something like that, in personal use cases, before we really realized the business need was what drove a lot of the growth we had. We tried the Dropbox referral model, and what actually ended up happening when we did this was users would create the absolute most spammy content ever to refer their friends and refer traffic online to Zapier. And it was terrible for us. Users would click through this content, try to set Zaps up, trying to learn about use cases. It was not, we killed that experiment pretty quickly early on and found the better way for referrals for us was our partners. I like to say that Zapier in our ecosystem of customers and partners, we make everyone in our ecosystem happy, hence the tagline, Zapier makes you happier. But we're doing a service for our users. They couldn't otherwise connect these products together. Their alternative is doing it manually or copying and pasting. For partners, we're actually making our partners really happy too, because these users are going to those partners Dropbox or Eventbrite or HubSpot or Podio or any of these folks and begging them for integrations, and they have to, their sales team and support team is no, it's on our roadmap, we'll think about building it, thanks for your feedback, maybe someday, right? The classic not yet answer. So Zapier gives them a way to say yes. They can say, yes, we support that, here's the link to Zapier to set that up. So that's what really works for us from a referral standpoint, is finding the people in our ecosystem that we can deliver a lot of value to for them to refer it to us. And that's how that part of the business is scaled really well.
So would you say that referrals drive 90% of your traffic and word of mouth?
It's 50% probably.
Cool. And I want to dive a little bit into some of the people that you've met in Silicon Valley that have really helped you guys out. So as a young team, you're in Y Combinator, and maybe dive into that story first. And people that go through accelerators like Y Combinator, sometimes they have mixed experiences, right? I was talking to the team at Lead Genius as well as the team from Plevo, and it seems to be a little bit all over the place depending on where you're at with your startup, how well it's working, what advice you're getting, and where is it coming from. So talk about that experience and your feelings about going through accelerators. If anybody in the crowd right now is considering it, so.
It's kind of funny. I think one of the most valuable things that we got out of YC when we went through it was focus. So we were 3 dudes, Missouri, part-time, nights and weekends. We didn't have the focus to go full-time on it. And that's what YC gave us the permission to do. We were pretty young and early, and I think we were looking for that permission. I think this is something you can actually give to yourself. You can trick this. You don't necessarily need YC to give you this permission, but for us, it's what kicked us into motion and got it going. So for those 3 months, it convinced us, we rented an apartment in Mountain View. All of our friends and family were in Missouri. We knew no one in the Bay Area, and literally all we did for 18 hours a day was wake up and code and go back to sleep and go to the dinners on Tuesdays. We even left the dinners pretty early to go back and code more and talk to more customers. So really it just, that focus was really what I think the biggest value we got out of it was. Things went, I mentioned the story about launching our partnership deal in 5 weeks, that was during YC. That was that amount of intense focus we had. And I don't think that would have happened had we not had that experience. Or it might have happened, it just would have happened a lot slower and later.
And during the YC process or after, did you meet any key people who really helped your startup along the way, such as people who became advisors? Can you dive into that?
Yeah, one of my favorites, who's an angel investor in Zapier, Kevin Hale. At the time, he was not a partner at YC. He's actually left now, but Yeah, we got introduced him through YC alumni. He was a demo day, so part of like the YC network. And yeah, one of the best things Kevin did for us was he kind of validated that this was an okay way to build our business. So if you're not familiar with Zapier, we're basically bootstrapped. We did raise money back in 2012, but we've been profitable for 3 years. We got off that treadmill very quickly. And yeah, Kevin, before YC, he founded Wufoo, which was a company out of Florida. And they basically built Wufoo as a kind of a remote company where it was bootstrapped. And, you know, this is like a product-centric company that you don't need to go hyperscale. You don't need to go raise $1 million in order to be successful. And they eventually got acquired by SurveyMonkey. And one of Kevin's favorite slides is how much money they raised compared to what they exited at. And it's like a slide, you know, there's like a straight line graph of like the trend line of how much money people raise and how much they get acquired for. And it's, you know, roughly linear and most people are along it. And like Wufoo is like down here in the corner. And they're the only one. They raised like $100,000 and got acquired by 35 million or something like that. So they're a huge outlier, and that really inspired us and kind of gave us this validation. They're like, oh, this is like, we could do this. We don't need to go raise like a crap ton of money and in order to scale Zapier. And that really gelled with us because I think for, you know, again, 3 guys coming from Missouri, like, I don't know, there's like a sense of how you run a business, which is like you build a product, sell it to customers, and then you use that money to grow the company. The VC model was a little bit foreign to us at the time. Not to say it doesn't have use cases, I think that it certainly does, but for us, especially at that moment in time, yeah, Kevin was like a really big inspiration for us as far as the early days of Zapier and how we started to scale.
So just diving into funding, and I know many entrepreneurs come to San Francisco with the hopes of like getting funding and they just have an idea. And as someone who used to work at a VC firm, I used to see like people pitch so many different like products and ideas where I always just thought, I'm like, why don't you just bootstrap this? Like it just makes no sense of why you just need $500,000 right now.
You need no permission to bootstrap.
Yeah, that's very true. And can you dive into some of the misconceptions when it comes to funding and people saying like, oh, we need funding when you should really be bootstrapping? And I see this all over the place because, you know, granted, most people are reading like TechCrunch and they're reading all these publications that put these people in the limelight and they want to be like them, but it really is the wrong road for almost most of them.
Yeah, I would rather be like a much quieter company kicking ass than be like the public failures, right? Like given the 2 outcomes, which there seems to be some trends there. For us, like you know, pretty early on, we decided like that we wanted to grow the company in a bootstrap way. We did raise money; it did help us. I would say it accelerated the company by about 6 months, but that's it. I'm pretty sure we would have been able to hire and grow Zapier as much as we would have. It just would have been 6 to 12 months later. Which is actually, in retrospect, a pretty big trade-off, actually. Like, maybe I would have liked to keep that other 20% of equity, right, instead of selling it. But it did accelerate the growth rate, so that I think that was a benefit for us. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to dive into back into your product and talk a little bit about like traction and when you are deciding to do integrations, what is the process behind that, right? So someone wants to integrate with Zapier and all the thought that goes into, okay, they're worthy. So talk a little bit about that.
All of you are worthy. Yeah, we're actually an open platform. We don't have like any hard rules around like what gets on Zapier and what doesn't. We have like a style guide that we ask partners to follow and a couple like guidelines that we ask partners to go through when they're launching their app on Zapier. We've launched about 800 apps on Zapier now at this point over the last 3 or 4 years. So we've seen a lot of patterns of like what works and what doesn't. So that's mostly where our guidelines come from. But otherwise, like, yeah, like the value for Zapier to anyone who's like considering integrating is what I said before. Like your users likely are asking you for integrations with your product and other software that exists. And the value that Zapier can offer to you and your customers is you can integrate once with us and get maintained integrations with like these other 800, 750 plus apps for free. We don't charge partners. There's like, we charge users at the end of the day if they find value out of it. But yeah, it's basically a way for you to say yes to more of your customers during like that sales and support discussions.
Would you say it's very much like the Pareto principle where you'd say 20% of your integrations drive most of your zaps, or maybe it's 5% or even like 3%?
It's way more long tail than that. Our top use case isn't even 2% of our use cases. So there's no head on the tail. It's very long tail.
And what do you say that's just because the SaaS market's so big as it is, or just like B2B?
I think so. I think like if there's any wave that Zapier's riding, and this is I think one of the big things that in retrospect I think I look back and say like why has Zapier been as successful as it has, and we have a long way to go still, but why do we have so much momentum so far? And it seems to be around the platform. Like the wave we're riding is that SaaS apps are exploding. The number of it's like easier and easier to build a SaaS app. It's easier and easier to build a piece of software and charge for it online, and more so and these are like specialized tools, right? Like the way people build new SaaS apps online is they usually find a niche, they find like a customer base, maybe it's from consulting, they build a specialized product to solve that pain point, which really solves like those 1,000 customers' pain points. Now the thing is they usually want to connect it to other software that exists, and I think that's why Zapier's been successful is like from our point of view and from what we see, there's not really much consolidation happening in the SaaS market. You do have some tools out there like the Google Apps Suite that does have some of this, but by and large, SaaS is specializing, which has opened the way. It's opened the door for the wave to ride for SaaS to keep growing and for us to like keep getting customers from those companies.
So during the mid stages of the company, did you guys hit any traction blocks, like where you sort of stagnated a little bit, or was it pretty steady in terms of growth? And if you did hit any of these traction blocks, how did you solve them?
Yeah, traction blocks. Most of our growth comes from our lab platform, and we have had a lot of control over how quickly that grows because we can always build the apps ourselves. So whenever we would start to see, especially in the early days, when like that first year or two, whenever it was kind of like, what should we do to get more users? It was always like, well, what app do people want that's not on Zapier right now, and can we go build it? Or can we go talk to them and convince them to build it? Was usually a better angle for us. So yeah, that like, yes, we did. It was if you look at the curve of Zapier, we certainly had a very, very slow ramp up. A lot of the channels that we were developing around the landing pages and the partner referrals, that takes time. Those weren't overnight things. But yeah, we did have a lot of levers we could pull as far as like channels we had direct influence over, like building apps that we knew users wanted, and that was always something we could kickstart to get more users in the door.
And diving back into the thought process behind marketing and engineering, so talking to the founder of Mixmax, he mentioned about building on top of existing workflows. So people already work in Gmail. People already have, they have one SaaS software that they bought, they have another SaaS software that they bought, and then you're basically on top of this existing workflow, right? And you're just connecting the two. So should people dive more into this type of thought process when starting a company? Because it seems like most of these companies today are just sort of, I wouldn't say skyrocketing, but their growth trajectory is just insane. And all they're doing is just looking at what already exists and like, how can we make it better and just connect things?
Yeah, I mean, Zapier is basically, it's workflow automation software. We started out as one-to-one integration software, and we learned pretty quickly what people actually wanted to do, and the bigger value was for people to actually model, and what they were doing was modeling their workflows that they did inside Zapier. To give you the classic example of something that a customer might do with Zapier, and I've talked to several people who do this. Say you have like a lead form on your website. You collect leads. You want to run those leads through Clearbit and score them. Let's say let's say the lead comes from a company that uses a specific technology on their website that your market is going after. Use that to like put them into a CRM, a spreadsheet, and then set them up with like a drip email campaign using like GetDrip or Mailgun or Mandrill or something like that. And if not, like send them to your support team. And that whole like workflow that you might prototype for your business can be entirely written with like one Zap without having to know how to code. This is just like connecting UI blocks together, essentially. So yeah, I think there is a lot of value you can do, especially around prototyping. And in fact, I've actually seen quite a few companies. We've actually had quite a few companies that have like prototyped their entire business model on top of us. Some better examples than others. One of my most favorite ones is, have you ever heard of Seinfeld Text or KanyeText.com? Okay. Well, I can describe. So Kanye Text, you go on, you pay $5, you put a phone number in, and it will drip text messages to this person Kanye quotes for like 24 hours. This is entirely written in one Zap on Zapier. So obviously maybe not like a huge scalable company, but like this I think is a good example of things I've heard companies and Y Combinator companies actually that have prototyped their initial products without having to know how to code. These are like non-technical founders, they're marketers, growth hackers, People who don't have that coding ability, tools like Zapier can like allow you to get the same, or at least like 80% of the way there that you might see if you knew how to code. You can set up landing pages. You can do really well designed landing pages with like website builders these days, unbalanced landing page stuff. You can do email campaigns. You can basically fake a product using a tool like Zapier and off-the-shelf software.
Wow, it's giving me a lot of ideas. So I wanted to talk about the future of Zapier and where do you see, where are your expectations at? And are you guys looking to do anything like really big in the future? Are you guys releasing anything? Go for it.
Yeah. So in the near future, like looking ahead, probably 6 to 12 months, one of the biggest things was we released these multi-step Zaps. It was workflow automation about a year and a half ago. And one of the big things we started to see, and this is just like an evolution of like our product and our user has evolved, and our mentality of who our best users are has evolved ever since we started. We've had more and more teams starting to use Zapier. So Zapier today is like it's a single player product. You have a use case for it, maybe an inspiration of connecting to tools. You Google for a solution. You find Zapier. You sign up for it. You put your personal credit card or your expense card in, and you use it yourself. That was like before. Today, what we're starting to see is more and more is like teams of people where there's probably 10, 15, 20 people inside of a company or a team that is using Zapier in different capacities. And there's a lot of benefit for them to be able to like share Zaps. As an example of this inside Zapier, that's a pain point for us. One of our teammates set up a Zap that we lovingly refer to as MomBot. It drops mom quotes into our Slack channels on occasion, and he accidentally set up like an infinite loop on this Zap, which dropped thousands and thousands of messages into our general channel in Slack on one Monday afternoon. And we were like literally running around in Slack like, oh my God, who has this like automation set up? You must turn it off. So like these kind of pain points we've heard from our customers too, as far as like who owns that integration, what's that workflow doing. We're starting to build features and product features and like basically team accounts and sharing around some of that stuff to solve some of those pain points. I think like the bigger play for Zapier is like productivity software in general. There's an explosion of SaaS software. I don't think this is necessarily just limited to SaaS software. Anything that would be like in the purview, I think, of software to be able to make you more effective at your job and make you more productive is something that we might be interested in building someday. Today that's integrations. In the future, who knows? That could be account provisioning, could be data import, export. There's a lot of ideas we've heard from users, but nothing solid.
One of the things I'm really interested in, and you touched upon this a little bit earlier, was that if you wanted growth, you just integrate more apps. And this plays a lot into hiring. So if you want to integrate many more apps, you have to hire more people. So I want you to talk about some of the learning lessons you have as a co-founder in hiring people and scaling your team, and some of the good things you did, as well as some of the challenges you came across.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before. I think one of the most interesting things I've learned, especially being on the product side. So I run our product team, which basically is kind of like organizing the various cross-functional teams that we have and like what projects they're working on inside Zapier at any given moment and like what their goals and things are like that. And when we were first starting this, I was like our only product manager for probably about 3 years. We hired our first product manager like only like a year and a half ago, very late into the company, right? Very engineering led up to that point. And the biggest thing I saw, or what I thought, biggest misconception I had was we would be able to take our best performers and just like clone them. So like we could take like a team that was working really well and like, oh, here's like a prototypical really good designer. Here's a really prototypical good engineer. Here's a really good prototypical PM, and like find an exact duplicate of them and scale the company just by hiring more of those people. And I think what I learned in retrospect is like what actually ends up happening is you can define some core skill sets that you want to screen for when you hire, but everyone has like unique skill sets, even in those like that T-shape. And the game of like building a company is finding how do you put those T-shapes together in a way that makes sense that actually like achieves some kind of goal that you have or a product. A great example of this would be like, say you've got an engineer who actually has some like UX chops. You probably don't need to pair them up with like a senior designer. You might be able to pair them up with someone a bit more junior. Or say you've got like a front-end engineer who doesn't have as many visual design chops. You might want to pair them up with like a stronger visual designer who maybe doesn't have that like UX or information architecture design background. So that's, I think, like probably one of the biggest things I've learned scaling Zapier is just you can't clone people. Everyone has like unique skill sets, and putting them together is kind of the game to play.
And one of the things I'm so fascinated by is learning about like how do you guys communicate with each other as a remote team? What tools do you use? I know people are really big on Zoom, but what are the ones that you prefer?
Yeah, this is we talked about the upsides of remote work before, which was being able to hire people in any market, right? Being able to hire the best person who applies. The big downside for remote is communication, bar none. Like this is the challenging thing you have to figure out how to get right, and I think we've done a pretty good job of it. I think as we grow in Zapier, I think there's like a mental model of like 4 types of communication that people usually go through. Growing in bandwidth. So let's start on one end. You have no communication at all. So people are not talking, they're not texting, just like nobody talks. Moving up in the bandwidth, you've got text only. So this would be like group texting or live chat or group messaging or something like that. Then you move up in the bandwidth, you've got video. So Google Hangouts, Zoom, you're moving up bandwidth. And finally in person, which is where you get the highest bandwidth, where I can use body language, I can use nonverbal cues to communicate. But it's usually, as you move up in bandwidth, you're also moving up in like interruption. So this is the classic thing you usually see in co-located teams where someone can come over and like tap you on the shoulder, get your attention, and now you are like, I have perfect like 100% bandwidth with you, but like I've completely distracted you from whatever task you're working on. So in-person companies usually default to like the top-down, right? And a co-located company usually defaults to everyone is just tapping each other on the shoulder. It's the highest bandwidth, but the most interruptive. Remote teams literally like flip this around. The default mode of people in a remote team is nobody talks to each other. For a lot of reasons, actually. Like people fear being interruptive. They actually like fear this like tapping on the shoulder. They almost like worry about going into a channel and saying like in Slack or group chat or whatever you use and like asking a question because they feel like they're being interrupted and people are gonna like be upset that they asked a question or something like this. So we actually have to do a lot of coaching and work, especially with teammates who haven't worked remotely before, that like it's okay to ask questions. You should be explicit and intentional about when you want to move up that communication bandwidth train. I find myself one of my favorite, well, not favorite, but one of the moments I often commiserate a lot with my teammates around, especially on the product side, is in Slack the many people are typing moment. Like this is like intense, deep-seated fear with a lot of people in Zapier when they see this, because that means like there's an argument about to happen. So what I've like coached people on doing is like when you see this moment starting to happen, this is probably a good opportunity to be intentional and say, hey, let's raise this to a video call. Why are we typing in Slack? There's clearly a lot of opinions. Let's just jump on a 5-minute video call and hash this out. Move that bandwidth up, and then after the video call is done, I will usually suggest for whoever led the video call to like document a summary of what you talked about back into the team chat so that anyone in the future can get context on what you talked about. So being really intentional about communication is, I think, the biggest downside of, or not downside, but like the biggest challenge of remote, and I think it's solvable. And that's probably one of the biggest things. In terms of our tool setup, in addition to Slack, obviously Slack's our water cooler, we use one other tool that we actually built ourselves. This was inspired by WordPress called P2, I think, if anyone knows what that is. Basically, if you've ever read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, the Daniel Krugman book, Slack is our fast thinking. So Slack is like where you talk about your work, right? This is where we don't expect people to keep up in Slack. It's too fast paced. There's too many channels. Like fast thinking happens in Slack. Async, which is basically an internal blog we built modeled on P2, is our like slow thinking version of Slack. In fact, it's actually built into the design of the software. I was the one who built this tool for us, and I maintain it. And I intentionally didn't make it like live reload. I intentionally didn't put like Ajax into the refresh response cycle because I wanted it to feel like you were actually submitting like a really thoughtful long form comment. So like it's usually people put 500 plus words in like a post, and there's like long form comments people have discussions on, and it gives you an opportunity to just like digest things at a slower rate and actually think about things before you like talk about them. So for async, we use it as like a place to show your work. So Slack is where you talk about your work, and then when you have a final product to show to the team, or there's like a milestone or a checkpoint, usually you write up a long form or medium form content and put that on async. And that balance we found works really, really well.
So you talked a little bit about communication. Now I want you to dive into what is your onboarding process like, because you said that you have to basically train these people to be more expressive. And to me, that means that there's a very heavy onboarding process of actually not just teaching people like, hey, these are the tools that we're going to use, like sign up for them, yada, yada, yada. But this is like actually you need to step out of your comfort zone. So talk a little bit about that. Yeah,
I think one thing we look for actually when we're hiring is we try to screen for people who have and this isn't a hard rule, but we try to look for people who have remote work experience or at least know what that entails. We've hired a few people who haven't had remote work experience, and oftentimes that can lead to honestly, like a lot of social isolation if you don't know how to like be really explicit about like going outside of work to like talk to people. This is something I've seen several teammates do when they join. They kind of like drop all their other social obligations because they're used to using work as their like family replacement, and that doesn't work out super well. You end up sitting inside all day, like locked in your dark little room. So I know, whether you're replacing it with like friends outside work, networking like this, social communities, religious, family, whatever it is, like you have to find something outside of a remote team. I found in order to like just maintain your sanity for the long run. So from an interpersonal perspective, yeah, we do a lot of early coaching around this. If we see people like, spending too much time trying to like use Zapier as a family substitute. Apart from like other onboarding we do, so we do so we're a 100% remote team, 85 people. There is still a lot of value in getting in person. I talked again about like the 4 different types of like communication. In person has the highest bandwidth, and there is like good reason to go in person. One of which is onboarding, because when you're onboarding someone, you literally have the most amount of context you need to download into someone's head that you'll probably ever have. So we do, at this point in Zapier, once a month, we'll do a onboarding week. Usually it's in the Bay Area here, where we'll fly the new teammate out, plus usually maybe one other teammate that they're going to be working with, plus the founders, and use that as like a kickoff week to teach them everything they need to know about the role. Usually we've done like a remote onboarding week ahead of this to get them like used to the tools and like starting to talk to people in the company. That way they're not like blindsided on day one when they come out to California and meet with us for the first time. But yeah, there's like intentional good reasons to meet, I think, in person, especially for onboarding, because of that bandwidth. I know it's not to your question about onboarding, but one other thing we do intentional around in person is Zapier we do 2 team retreats per year. So we fly all 85 people to some location. At this point, we can't be too picky about the location. Usually our selection criteria is which place can hold like 100 people all at one time. But we find somewhere interesting in the US or Canada, somewhere nearby, and fly the entire team there and kind of make it like a hackathon. This has been super effective for us building interpersonal relationships between teammates. People find it really, really fun, and we're intentional about why we do it. And I think that's really beneficial. It puts like a human behind the Slack avatar a lot of times too. Written communication can sometimes come off a little bit curt, I found, and being able to like hear the other person's voice in your head often helps relay a lot of like communication that happens via text.
So we just talked a lot about onboarding, and I don't want to miss this part before we jump into the audience for questions, because I know many people actually come here to hear growth hacks. So I want to dive into growth hacks, especially the aspect of many people consider your product to be the best growth hack of itself. And what's your thought on that, as well as maybe some of the growth hacks that you guys use to grow Zapier?
Got it. What were some early things we did? So like my favorite example of this, we talked about the landing page one already. That was honestly one of the best things we did early on to decide what to build and what to build first. The early days when we were trying to scrap like our first customers together, when we had no marketing engine, no one knew what Zapier was, like we had no brand. The thing we would do is go to our customers, and this is honestly the thing I talk to like startups about doing too, is like you just need to go to your customers wherever they are, whether they're in the world somewhere online. You got to go seek them out because they're not going to come to you. And usually like you can kind of trick this with like advertising. I found if you can hack it and spend money to do this. The thing that I found work better is like to go where your customers are naturally hanging out, not try to like interrupt them in the middle of something else they're doing. So an example for this for us was we mentioned the high-rise. I mentioned the high-rise blog post earlier about like 37 signals, built-in integration. There's like hundreds of people begging for integrations on this. We would go on and like drop a comment on this like blog post and say, and like track down people and say, hey, I saw you were like begging for this online. You really seem to want this. I know like it doesn't seem like 37 Signals is ever going to build this. That's it's just not worth their time. But we're working on a project. If you're interested in like maybe trying it out, like let me know, and just give an email address. Another thing we did was on webapps.stackexchange.com. People would go on here all the time and ask for, or even just stackexchange.com would go on and ask for like, how do I build API integrations between Facebook and Highrise or something, or Facebook and Twitter. And we would go on and actually write code to answer these questions. Brian and I would sit down at night and literally like write up like a little gist that would accomplish what they want. Writing API integration code is very simple, so this wasn't a very hard exercise for us as engineers. We would paste it into the comment and say, hey, here's how to do it. By the way, if you don't know how to code and you want to like do this yourself, we're also working on like a side project that does it. Here's like a link to it. So we like try to give some value back to anyone who would stumble across this in the future. We try to answer the question and like give people the value that they wanted, which was like, what's the code to do this? But then also we realized like, and our hypothesis was a lot of people who want to know how to do this don't know how to code. And like those answers already had pretty good search result ranking. So figured like anyone who stumbles across this might click on this and like read the entire answer and like click through us to one of our landing pages. So yeah, it's just going to where users are, and your users might not be on Stack Exchange, they might not be on Comment Blog Force, but I bet there are forums out there that like it contain users, LinkedIn groups, Facebook groups. Like there's probably somewhere where users are living in like the natural environment, and can you go there and like provide some real value for being there? And then also you can also often just like politely ask if you want more value. I'm working on this like side thing that you might check out.
And did you guys use any ways to actually like connect with these people at scale rather than just individually? Were you doing any scraping of comments, any of that type of stuff?
No, not like I remember. All of our original, all the momentum that kicked off Zapier through 2012 was all like manual work we were doing to get customers, getting them on the phone, walking them through it. Probably the most automated thing we did was we put up like landing pages for the apps that we thought people really wanted to use. But we still had to drive users to those landing pages, which was manually going out and finding where those customers were in the world and like linking them back to it.
In other words, like pure hustle.
Yeah. I mean, that would really describe the first 3 months of Zapier. This was basically Wade's full-time job. Was finding customers online and trying to convince them to talk to him so that he could get them to use Zapier software. In fact, like the anecdote here is like our software was so bad at the time. Andrew Warner was like our first customer. He was the first person who paid us $100. And Wade, we found him. He was like on, I think he mentioned on Twitter or was complaining about it somewhere. And we emailed him and like Andrew, for three guys from Missouri, seemed like way up here, right? In like the social stats. So we were kind of like imposter syndrome reaching out to him. We're like, hey, Andrew, we've got something you might be able to use, not expecting a reply, and emailed us back, and Wade jumped on the phone the next day with him. And the software was so bad, literally like Wade had to use the software for him. Like, and this goes for the first like 100, 200 customers we had. No one could use Zapier themselves. We literally had to use the software on behalf of our customers, but it proved that like people were willing to pay for it because we asked them to pay money, and it proved that like this was worth figuring out how to get the UX right because people really wanted it. It was a lot of hustle the first couple of months.
And would you say that helped tremendously in like customer development? You said it helped with UX, and maybe that was where you got a ton of your aha moments, and where people tend to skip over. They're like, oh, we got to do this manual. Why don't we just get funding, like hire some people and do this? And they skip over like all their customer development. Yeah,
we definitely learned how much our software sucked during those 3 months. That's definitely a true learning we had. Basically, while Wade was chasing down these leads and talking to them and like getting them set up on software, Brian and I were literally like watching these video replays and like trying to figure out, all right, how do we like actually build this thing that people can actually use in parallel with all that work happening. Another reason why having co-founders is really useful is you can do two things at once, or in our case, three things at once.
So before we jump into the audience for questions, one of the things I like to ask founders or marketers who come up here is if you had one piece of advice or two pieces of advice that you would give early stage founders right now who are looking to jump into tech, start companies, what is something that they could skip over that would save them a ton of pain?
Don't skip over side projects. That would be my number one big piece of advice. Even if you're not an engineer, there are ways you can put together side projects and meet up with people. You can build stuff. You can prototype stuff with Zapier, not to toot our own horn too much, but like there's lots of ways you can like get something spun up as a side project. Zapier wouldn't have happened had I not been not building side projects. This was one of the reasons why I connected with Brian, was because we were both working on side projects together and we started wanting to talk about them. Same thing for Brian. This is where the like idea inspiration came from. So that would be my big number one piece of advice for anyone that's like not in a company but thinking about it someday and looking for co-founders or ideas, is like just find things that excite you outside your like day-to-day work, or maybe even things that like suck about your day-to-day work, and like maybe try fixing it in some way. It's been surprising how many opportunities that's led to.
Wow, great advice. I think many people here are trying to figure out how they turn their side hustle and their full-time hustle. And it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of encouragement seeing you do it and do it very successfully. So jumping into the audience for questions, we're only going to take several, but I'm going to walk around really quick and hand the mic to some people.
Yeah. So do you guys require voice chat as opposed, or I'm sorry, video chat over voice chat? And then can you talk about how you develop the culture in the company through the various communication via remote?
Yes. So I probably don't need to repeat the question, right? Because everyone can hear. So voice chat versus video chat. No, we don't require it. Everyone defaults, like Slack is our water cooler. So 80% of the communication that happens in Zapier on a weekly basis is text chat. To re-up what I said before, like the one thing we try to really do is be intentional about when we need to move that bandwidth up. Whether it's like we have more to communicate during this time with like a weekly meeting, whether it's an in-person meeting because we actually want to like build rapport or like build some of that culture. We're just very intentional about when to do it, but we don't require it. Your question for like culture, how do we build culture in a remote team? I think actually the in-person stuff actually is some of the most important things we do. So the remote onboarding is a chance for like new teammates to come out and meet like Brian, Wade, and I. So they actually get to absorb some of like the culture from like the three founders. Slack obviously is basically our water cooler. So a lot of like, if I had to like represent Zapier's like interpersonal culture, it'll all be like very internet memey, very classic, like what you'd probably expect. And then, looking at like the values that we hold, like those are things that early on, Brian and I, White and I just embodied very often. We wrote down and like talk over and over about with the team. Those are probably the big ways.
Thanks, Mike. So you mentioned that three main marketing channels for you guys right now are referrals, word of mouth, and landing pages. But landing pages is not really a channel and only half of an answer. And the real question is, how do you drive traffic to those landing pages? And you kind of touched upon that for the early days. My question is, how do you drive traffic to those landing pages today?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So the landing pages basically get two sources of traffic these days. The first is we do pretty well in search. So if you go on Google and like type in, two names of apps, usually we have like a search result on one of those pages. And the other way is our partners link to it. This is actually one of like the big magic moments we realized early on was like, wow, we can actually get the partners, like these other apps we integrate with, we can give them enough value that they were willing to link to us. Early days, it wasn't like anything official. So these days we actually have like listings and integration directories, like Salesforce has their app exchange. We've, that model many companies follow. So we have links all over these. Another one we did too was like help documentation. This is usually a way you can bootstrap your way into like getting content written about you if there's some natural integration between your product and something else. Is usually like customer support and customer success teams have like unfettered access to the CMS for pages on their website that they can drive links to. So this was another thing we learned early on was like, if we can't get like a dedicated landing page on their side to link to us, we can probably talk to their support team and convince them at least that it's worth like documenting how Zapier works and how it works with their product and get them to link to us.
Can you talk about how you manage different time zones and working hours of people in different time zones? And related to that is the goal setting for different people, because you don't meet them face to face.
What was the last part?
The goal setting. How do you manage goals and objectives?
Yeah. So time zones is an interesting thing. I originally thought this would be a bigger problem, actually, as we started scaling remote. We have people in, I like to say like the sun never sets in Zapier land. We have people in pretty much every time zone at this point now all over the world. Two big ways we counter this. The first one is I actually don't think it's important that you have complete overlap on time zones. We don't have standard hours in Zapier. No one is expected to work 9 to 5 their local time zone or anything like this. The big thing I coach our individual like teammates on is make sure you find like at least 1 to 2 hours of overlap with whoever your immediate teammates are that you're working with. So just to use like the easy example, like if there's an engineer and a PM that are working on the same cross-functional team together, and maybe one's in like Portugal and one is in like the West Coast here, there's not a lot of overlap in those time zones, but can you make time zone either by time shifting or just making sure like, 8 a.m., 9 a.m., like every day, you two are online together. And the reason why this is important is just to unblock each other. Like the danger with with time zones is like if you're in completely opposite time zones and you're blocked, there's no way to like help unblock the other person. So finding some overlap has helped a lot. There's actually an upside here, though. You might think this is all downside time zones. There's actually one big upside to it, which is if you find the right cadence, especially in like cross-functional teams, you can actually work around the clock. So if you can find a designer who's like working for their 8 hours and then they're like, okay, I'm kind of ready to like implement this now and like give it to a front-end engineer who's actually then working for the next 8 hours in their own time zone to build it. By the time the designer wakes up, they're like ready to go for the next step, and you've just cut out like an entire day out of your like iteration speed. So there are some interesting benefits you can get from there at scale. And then you asked goal setting in a remote company. I wouldn't say it's any different than how you would do it in a like co-located company. Just be intentional about what you want people to do and make that clear. I mean, I have more thoughts on that, but nothing specific to like how a remote company would be run.
So I actually found out about Zapier about a year ago when I was in general researching remote companies. So it's kind of like I was attracted to the culture first and then the product. So right now I have a remote job, and I'm sure, sooner or later I'll be interested in Zapier again. So it's a talent acquisition type question. So what have you noticed that your top performers, maybe a couple of skills that your top performers have in common and what you look for?
Yeah, good question. Especially in a remote team. Over communication, number one, by far. Our top performers in Zapier are really, really good at over communicating about what they're working on to the point where it probably feels uncomfortable for them. These might be engineers, designers, support, marketing, whatever it is. Like you have your own projects you're working on, and the only way for other people to get context on that project and to help you out with your project is to like literally log everything you do back into Slack somewhere. We've set up Slack in a way that we have like project channels for all of these teams to work in, so those channels don't get too noisy and you can subscribe to the ones that you want to. I wouldn't recommend doing this back into like one of our 80 people cross-functional channels that we have, but certainly for one of our team-specific channels, this is one of the best things that I've seen people do. The other really big one that we have that makes people successful in Zapier is it's actually it's our number one value, defaulting to action. So the way that this really manifests itself is people who can unblock themselves. So if you are someone who needs to be motivated by like someone telling you what to do and you can't figure out ways to like unblock yourself and find out something good to work on when no one is telling you what to do, you're probably going to be pretty unsuccessful at Zapier. And probably in a remote company, I'd say in general. So being able to like, you're going to always, of course, have work to do, but like if you get blocked on it, finding something that's valuable to contribute, that's outside your core role, or maybe in your core role and just no one's told you to do it, but you think it's important, is probably one of the biggest things our high performers have.
Hey, great talk so far. So on the later stages of a company, when you have achieved scale, it's easier to manage culture and build it. During your earlier stages, my question is, during your earlier stages when you had fewer resources, culture is even more important. How did you police your culture at that time?
I'd say it's actually harder to build culture at like a large scale because you have less control over it. There's way more individual actors that are embodying the cultural values than you can see. Like I have no visibility in all the communication messages that go through Zapier these days, whereas in the early days, I could literally see every single thing anyone mentioned inside the company because there was like 6 of us and we all talked in one channel. So it was actually easier to do because if we saw things that like that didn't embody defaulting to action, if we saw somebody get blocked on something and wanted them to like think outside the box to figure out how to like unblock themselves, that was like really easy to spot. So for us it was actually the opposite. We had an opposite experience there.
Hey Mike, great talk. Thanks for calling me out tonight. With doing remote employees across the globe, what are you doing, or have you thought about IP protection at all, making sure somebody doesn't take a piece or more than a piece and walk off and become the AliExpress to Alibaba, so to speak?
Nothing more than just standard employment. I mean, we basically look at this comes back to down to hiring at the end of the day. Like we try to hire people that are top performers in their fields, people we trust, people who have remote experience. Like there's nothing special we do to try to prevent this outside of just our standard employment agreements. I think it would be pretty hard to clone Zapier at this point anyway, so there may be some inherent difficulties to just like cloning what Zapier is because of like the network effects we have with the platform. I mean, it all comes down to hiring, like hiring good people you trust, people who embody the values. That's the big thing. Yep.
Yeah, so thank you guys so much for coming out, and for Mike for showing up tonight. This is like really huge. He is one of our biggest speakers to come here, and so happy he could talk about his story of how he grew his company, Zapier. I mean, this is like one of the most renowned stories in the Valley, and I don't think it's talked about enough. So thank you so much for being here, and I just want to give you a huge
Josh.
round of applause. And of course, we do have drinks, so you're welcome to kick it here, network, take some beers, and a huge thank you to Autopilot for sponsoring all these events. So yeah, I think Mike will be here for a bit.
Yeah, I'm gonna hang out. I'll float around. So if you want to come ask questions, I'll be around.
Boom, there we go. Cheers, guys.